Picture a 12-year-old boy standing naked on a marble platform in the heart of Rome, its most exclusive slave market. Tears streaming down his face as wealthy aristocrats examine his body like he is a piece of expensive livestock. The bidding starts at 50,000 denarii, enough to buy a luxury villa. But it doesn't stop there. By the time the auction ends, this child will cost more than Emperor Trajan's new palace, making him the most expensive human being ever sold in the Roman Empire. His name was Alexios, and what happened to him represents the most heartbreaking example of how Rome treated children as luxury commodities to be bought, used, and discarded when they were no longer profitable. But here is the part that will destroy you. After years of being molded into the perfect companion, after becoming more valuable than gold itself, his owners threw him away like garbage the moment he stopped being useful to them. Before we dive into this forgotten tragedy that reveals the darkest side of Roman society, if you're interested in the shocking truths that history tried to hide, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible how we can explore these ancient stories of suffering together, connected across time by our shared need to understand what humans are capable of doing to each other. What you're about to hear isn't just another story of Roman slavery. This is about a system so cruel and calculated that it turned childhood innocence into a luxury product with a price tag higher than entire cities. Alexios didn't just lose his freedom. He lost his identity, his humanity, and ultimately his life. All so that Rome's elite could possess something they considered more precious than any treasure in the empire. The nightmare begins in 98 AD, in a small Greek village on the island of Crete, where Alexios lived what should have been a normal childhood with his parents and younger sister. His father was a potter, his mother wove cloth for the local market, and their family scraped by on the modest income that kept food on their table and a roof over their heads. Alexios was everything parents dream of in a son: intelligent, kind, naturally graceful, with the kind of ethereal beauty that made strangers stop and stare when he walked through the village square. But that beauty would become his death sentence. In 110 AD, when Alexios had just turned 12, Roman slave raiders struck their village without warning. These weren't random pirates or desperate bandits. They were professional procurement specialists working for Rome's luxury slave trade, equipped with detailed intelligence about which children in remote Greek communities possessed the specific qualities that wealthy Romans were willing to pay fortunes to own. The attack happened at dawn, while most of the village was still sleeping. Alexios woke to his mother's screams as armed men smashed through their door, dragging him from his bed, while his parents begged and pleaded for mercy that would never come. The last thing he saw of his family was his father being run through with a sword for trying to protect his son, and his mother collapsing over his little sister's body as the raiders decided she was too young to be profitable. The journey to Rome was 3 weeks of hell, designed to break the children's spirits before they reached market. Alexios and dozens of other captured kids were chained together in the hold of a slave ship, given just enough food and water to keep them alive, but weak enough to prevent escape attempts. The older children tried to comfort the younger ones. But what comfort could there be when they all understood they would never see their families again? But Alexios's real torture began when they reached Rome's slave processing centers, where children were evaluated, categorized, and prepared for different market segments based on their potential value. The moment the slave dealers saw him, they knew they had something extraordinary. A child whose combination of intelligence, beauty, and natural refinement could be transformed into the kind of luxury companion that Rome's wealthiest citizens would pay astronomical sums to possess. Here's where the story becomes truly horrifying. Alexios wasn't just thrown into general slavery. He was selected for the Delicatus program, an elite training system that transformed beautiful children into perfect human accessories for the super rich. This wasn't education. It was systematic, psychological reconstruction designed to erase everything that made him human and replace it with artificial perfection. The training facility where Alexios spent the next 2 years was like a prison disguised as a school. Children were housed in individual cells to prevent them from forming emotional bonds with each other. fed precisely measured meals to maintain optimal appearance, and subjected to daily lessons that stripped away their original personalities piece by piece. Alexios had to learn to walk differently, talk differently, even think differently, until nothing remained of the Greek boy who had once helped his father with pottery and played with his sister in their village garden. The physical conditioning was brutal beyond imagination. Alexios's body was constantly monitored and adjusted to maintain the ethereal, almost supernatural beauty that made delicate slaves so valuable. His diet was controlled down to the individual grape. His exercise regimen designed to create graceful muscle tone without bulk. His skin treated with expensive oils and cosmetics that cost more than most Romans earned in a year. But the psychological conditioning was even more devastating. Alexios was taught to suppress every natural emotion and desire, to become a blank canvas onto which his future owner could project whatever fantasies they wanted to indulge. He learned to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to provide perfect companionship without ever displaying independent thoughts or feelings, to be simultaneously present and invisible, depending on his master's moods. The training included lessons that would horrify modern audiences, instruction in intimate services that no child should ever have to learn, conditioning to accept physical and emotional abuse as normal expressions of his owner's affection, and psychological techniques to dissociate from his own suffering so completely that he could smile serenely while enduring unimaginable violations of his dignity and body. By the time Alexios was 14 and ready for sale, he had been transformed into something that barely resembled a human child. He moved with inhuman grace, spoke in perfectly modulated tones, and radiated the kind of ethereal beauty that made him seem like a living work of art. But behind his perfectly trained eyes was a child who had been so thoroughly broken that he could no longer remember what it felt like to have his own thoughts or desires. The auction that would make Alexios the most expensive slave in Roman history took place in the Forum Boarium, where Rome's wealthiest citizens gathered to bid on the rarest and most valuable human commodities. Word had spread through aristocratic circles that something special was being offered, a delicatessen of unprecedented quality whose training had cost more than most people's houses. The bidding war that erupted was unprecedented in the annals of Roman slavery. Senator Marcus Crassus opened with an offer of 100,000 denarii, already enough to buy a palatial estate. But within minutes, the price had doubled, then tripled, as Rome's elite engaged in a competition that was less about owning a slave and more about demonstrating their wealth and status to their peers. The final winning bid came from Gaius Petronius Maximus, one of the richest men in the empire and a close friend of Emperor Trajan. The price he paid, minus 750,000 denarii, was more than the annual budget of most Roman cities, more than the cost of Trajan's new palace complex, more than the value of entire fleets of merchant ships. Alexios had become the most expensive human being in recorded history, but this astronomical price tag came with expectations that no 14-year-old child could possibly fulfill. Petronius had just bought a slave. He had made an investment that he expected to provide perfect service, constant entertainment, and flawless companionship for years to come. Every moment of Alexios's existence was now devoted to justifying that enormous expenditure, and any failure to meet his master's expectations could result in punishments that made his training seem gentle by comparison. Life in Petronius' household was a gilded prison where Alexios lived surrounded by luxury while being denied every basic human need except survival. He wore clothes that cost more than senators' annual salaries, ate foods imported from the far reaches of the empire, and lived in quarters more beautiful than most free Romans could ever afford. But he couldn't speak unless spoken to, couldn't express preferences or opinions, couldn't form relationships with other household members, and certainly couldn't display any sign of the trauma and grief that consumed him every waking moment. The daily routine that Petronius established for his expensive acquisition was designed to maximize the entertainment value of his investment. Alexios was expected to be available 24 hours a day, ready to provide conversation, entertainment, or more intimate services whenever his master desired. He attended dinner parties where he was displayed like a prized possession, accompanied Petronius to the baths where his beauty attracted envious stares from other wealthy Romans, and performed at social gatherings where his training in music, poetry, and dance provided amusement for guests. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of Alexios' situation was that his extraordinary value made him simultaneously precious and completely disposable. Petronius treated him like a priceless artwork that required careful maintenance and protection, but also like property that could be damaged or destroyed if it failed to provide adequate satisfaction. The boy lived in constant terror that a single mistake, a moment of imperfect performance, or a sign of normal human emotion might trigger his master's displeasure and result in punishment that could permanently damage his market value. The psychological isolation was perhaps the most devastating aspect of his captivity. Alexios existed in a world where every person around him saw him as an object rather than a child, where his suffering was invisible because acknowledging it would interfere with his function as entertainment. He had no one to talk to about his memories of family and home, no way to process the trauma of his capture and conditioning, no hope of ever being treated as a human being rather than an expensive toy. As months turned to years, Alexios began showing signs of the psychological damage that inevitably resulted from his impossible situation. Despite his training in emotional suppression, he started having nightmares that interfered with his sleep, developing nervous habits that marred his perfect composure, and occasionally displaying flashes of the anger and grief that he had been taught to hide. These cracks in his artificial perfection did not go unnoticed by Petronius, who became increasingly dissatisfied with his expensive investment. The beginning of the end came when Alexios reached his 16th birthday and began showing signs of physical maturity that threatened his value as the ethereal, almost sexless beauty that had made him so desirable was gradually being replaced by the normal development of a teenage boy becoming a young man. His voice began changing. His body developed muscle mass that interfered with his graceful appearance, and his face lost some of the childlike perfection that had justified his astronomical purchase price. Petronius watched these changes with growing frustration and anger. He had paid more than a palace for a perfect companion who would remain unchanged forever. And the natural process of human development felt like a betrayal of his investment. He consulted with physicians about ways to halt or reverse Alexios's maturation, subjecting the teenager to experimental treatments and surgical procedures that were both painful and ultimately futile. But the real crisis came when Petronius realized that his guests were no longer impressed by his expensive acquisition. The novelty of owning the most costly slave in Roman history had worn off, and Alexios' subtle signs of psychological damage combined with his physical maturation made him less entertaining than he had been during his first years of captivity. The return on Petronius's massive investment was declining, and his pride in displaying his costly possession was being replaced by embarrassment at its diminishing value. The decision to dispose of Alexios was made with the same cold calculation that had driven his original purchase. Petronius consulted with slave dealers about the best way to liquidate his investment before its value declined further, treating the boy like a stock portfolio that needed to be restructured for better performance. The options were limited and all horrifying. Sale to a gladiator school, where his beauty would be destroyed through combat training, transfer to a brothel, where his remaining years would be spent servicing customers, or outright execution to prevent him from competing with newer, more valuable acquisitions. The method Petronius chose was perhaps the cruelest of all available options. Rather than selling Alexios and allowing him to continue existing in some form, he decided to have the boy killed in a way that would serve as entertainment for his dinner guests, while demonstrating his power to destroy something of enormous value simply because he could. The execution was planned as the climax of an elaborate dinner party, where Alexios would perform one final service for his master before being disposed of like expensive garbage. The night of the dinner party, Alexios understood what was about to happen. Despite years of conditioning that had taught him to suppress his emotions, He could unhide his terror as he was brought before Petronius' guests and told that this would be his final performance. The boy who had cost more than a palace, who had been trained to perfect artificial grace, who had endured years of psychological torture for the entertainment of Rome's elite, was about to be murdered for the same audience's amusement. But in his final moments, something extraordinary happened. As Petronius prepared to give the signal for his execution, Alexios did something he had never been allowed to do in 4 years of captivity. He spoke his own words, expressing his own thoughts and feelings, rather than performing the responses he had been trained to provide. In a voice that cracked with emotion and fear, he told the assembled guests about his family, his village, his memories of a life before he became their entertainment, and his understanding of what they were about to do to him. The speech lasted only a few minutes, but its impact on Petronius' guests was profound and disturbing. For the first time, they were forced to confront the reality that their entertainment was based on the systematic destruction of a human child's life and identity. Some of the guests reportedly left the dinner party rather than witness the execution, while others sat in uncomfortable silence as they processed the implications of what they had been enjoying for years. Alexios died that night, killed by the same system that had made him the most expensive human being in Roman history. His final act of defiance, speaking as himself rather than as his owner's property, had lasted only moments. But it represented the first time in years that he had existed as a person rather than as an object. In death, he reclaimed the humanity that had been systematically stripped away from him since childhood. The broader implications of Alexios' story extended far beyond his individual tragedy to reveal the systematic cruelty that characterized Rome's luxury slave trade. His case demonstrated how the empire's enormous wealth and sophisticated culture coexisted with a form of human exploitation so extreme that it transformed children into commodities more valuable than buildings or artwork. The economic aspects of his story also reveal disturbing truths about Roman society's priorities and values. The fact that wealthy Romans were willing to pay more for a trained child than for palaces or fleets demonstrated a level of moral corruption that helped explain the empire's eventual decline and fall. When a civilization reaches a point where human suffering becomes luxury entertainment, worth more than architectural marvels, it has lost touch with the basic values that make society sustainable. But perhaps most tragically, Alexios' story represents thousands of similar cases that have been lost to history. The Roman luxury slave trade involved countless children who were captured, trained, and discarded according to the whims of wealthy owners who treated human lives as renewable resources. Archaeological evidence and scattered historical references suggest that the systematic destruction of children for entertainment was not exceptional, but routine, a regular feature of Roman society that was so normalized it rarely merited detailed historical record. Modern historians studying Roman slavery have used cases like Alexios' to understand how economic systems can create incentives for the most extreme forms of human exploitation. The enormous profits available from luxury slavery encouraged networks of kidnapping, trafficking, and systematic abuse that extended throughout the known world, destroying countless families and communities to supply Rome's appetite for human commodities. Yet, Alexios' story also serves as a reminder of individual human dignity and resilience in the face of systematic dehumanization. Despite years of conditioning designed to erase his identity and transform him into an object, he retained enough of his authentic self to speak his own words in his final moments. This brief assertion of personhood, even in the face of death, represents something that his owners could never completely destroy: the fundamental human capacity to maintain some sense of individual identity even under the most oppressive circumstances. His legacy challenges modern readers to examine their own society's treatment of vulnerable people, particularly children, who possess qualities that make them valuable to adults in positions of power. While we may not have formal slavery, we still live in a world where children's beauty, talent, and innocence can be exploited for profit and adult gratification. and where economic systems can create incentives for treating human beings as commodities rather than individuals deserving protection and respect. The boy who cost more than a palace and was thrown away like garbage serves as both a historical curiosity and a moral challenge, forcing us to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between wealth, power, and human dignity. His story reminds us that behind every system of exploitation, there are individual human beings whose suffering deserves our attention and compassion, not just as lessons from the past, but as warnings about what can happen when societies lose sight of their fundamental obligation to protect rather than exploit the most vulnerable among them. If this story of childhood destroyed by adult greed and the ultimate price of treating human beings as luxury commodities has affected you, I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Alexios's ordeal disturbs you most? The systematic training that erased his identity, the astronomical price paid for a child's suffering, or the casual disposal when he was no longer profitable? And if you're interested in more stories that reveal the hidden human costs behind historical wealth and power, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the past is filled with individual tragedies that deserve our attention as reminders of both human cruelty and human resilience in the face of impossible circumstances.